Thank you, Joel. And good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Desert. I'm Stephen Toporoff, and I'm your service leader for today. You probably have noticed that Rev Ian is not here with us, so I have the honor of filling in for him. In the 25 years that I have been a UU, I've led chalice circles, gave reflections, and a few sermons, but this is the first time that I'm conducting a full service. So I might be doing things a little bit differently. Hopefully all will go smoothly, and I ask for your patience. I'm glad you are with us today, whether you are in the sanctuary or watching the service from home online. To learn more about us, you can visit our website at uucod.org. And to become part of our mailing list, please write to admin, ADMIN, at uucod.org. And before we begin, please take a moment to silence your cell phones or any other devices you may have. And I thank you for that. It is our practice each Sunday to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded lands of the Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla people. And we commit to grow in our understanding and relationship with this land and with the people who inhabited it and nurtured it before our arrival. In this congregation, we strive to honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person. You are welcome here no matter your background, race, ancestry, and culture. We welcome people of all sexual orientations and gender identities, of all ages and sizes, people of all economic statuses and professions, of all physical and mental abilities. We welcome you wherever you are from, whoever you love, whatever your immigration status or civic engagement. We welcome all those who will learn and grow with us as we commit together to embrace the rich and beautiful diversity of the world, and to build a community centered in justice, compassion, and love. And now I invite Jane Zahn to come forward and ring our Tibetan bowl, followed by our music for centering. I've known Frank for about 15 years now. We met at a party one evening in Washington, D.C. Our meeting was like a classic joke. An Episcopal minister meets a Unitarian at the home of a Persian Muslim. I don't remember much about that evening except for meeting Frank. And if my memory serves me correctly, Frank and I engaged in some kind of interesting theological discussion. I probably saw Frank a few times after that, but pretty much lost touch. That was until I found out that he and his husband, Joe, were moving to Palm Springs at about the exact same time that we were moving. I reached out to Frank, we reconnected, and have been friends since. Here's a little bit of background about Frank. Frank was born and raised in Conway, South Carolina. Frank holds a BA in English from Randolph-Macon College. He studied theology, concentrating on American church history at Princeton Theological Seminary, and graduate work at the General Theological Seminary in New York. Later, he attained his Doctor of Ministry degree from the Virginia Theological Seminary. After being ordained, Frank held several positions in churches on the East Coast, including in Charlotte, North Carolina, Newton, Connecticut, Lynchburg, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. During his career, Frank has been involved in all aspects of church life and administration. Among other things, he was instrumental in developing numerous community social programs, including the Family Life Center of Newton, which focused on affordable social services, and Amos House of Danbury, a facility for transitional housing for the homeless. He also developed training programs involving worship, pastoral care, education, and outreach. Other projects involved reimagining the priesthood in a non-hierarchical leadership structure, as well as reorganizing congregations and missions to meet the challenges of a changing social and economic climate. Finally, about 10 years ago, Frank founded Jonathan Circle, a nonprofit worldwide organization whose mission is to make safe spaces for adult men to integrate their spiritual life and sexuality. Frank Dunn will chat with us this morning about lessons learned over his decades-long career in the church. It is my pleasure to welcome Frank, and I look forward to hearing his words later this morning. And now for our opening hymn. Many of you know I do not sing, so I am calling on our good friend Roger Beeman to come forward and join us in singing When Our Heart is in a Holy Place. And I invite Monty Hetland to come forward to light our chalice. And as he does so, please read along. Okay. May love be the spirit of the church. May the quest for truth be its sacrament, and the purpose be its prayer, to dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, and to help one another in fellowship. This is our aspiration. And will Sarita come forward to light the BioPOC candles? And please read along. We light these candles in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and other people of color as we journey together toward spiritual wholeness. May we as the beloved community work to dismantle racism and all forms of oppression. May we live out our principles so that justice, dignity, and equity all prevail. Thank you. Today is Share the Plate Sunday. Over the summer, it has become our practice to share the plate with Galilee Center. Your generous giving will be used to buy backpacks and school supplies for East Valley students in kindergarten through the 12th grade. In mid-August, school will be back in session for East Valley students attending Coachella Valley Unified School District. For the past 2 months, Galilee Center in Mecca has been receiving donated backpacks and school supplies for these students. Not only UUCOD, but other organizations donate backpacks and school supplies as well. Unfortunately, Galilee Center still comes up short. Your generous giving for today's Share the Plate will enable Galilee Center to ensure that each student receives a backpack filled with the grade-appropriate supplies needed to have a successful school year. To help us understand the need, Lupe Torres Hilario, the Director of Operations and Volunteering at Galilee Center, shares that every year the number of students coming to the distribution center gets larger and larger. Last year, almost 900 students were able to choose their own backpacks. This year, she expects more than 1,000 students will come through. Won't you please give as generously as you are able? If you are here in the sanctuary and wish to write a check, please make it out to UUCOD. And if you are watching online, you can donate by clicking the link you were emailed earlier this morning. Those are the joys and sorrows that are voiced this Sunday morning. I'm sure there are countless other joys and numerous sorrows that are unspoken. Surely there are people we know, perhaps ourselves, who are hurting in their body, in their mind, or their spirit. Let's take a moment of silence and acknowledge the blessings we have received this week, or perhaps think about those in our lives who may need our positive energy, some support, perhaps a phone call, text, or card. Let all those who are in our hearts this morning find healing and comfort. May they be content and at peace. And now let's sing our hymn for meditation, Spirit of Life, Fuente de Amor.
Rise in the sea.
And now I bring you the Reverend Frank Dunn.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning. I'm grateful for the opportunity of being with you this morning, and especially for Stephen's trusting me enough to invite me to show me off. Since I live in a tradition that in some ways is quite different from yours, I'm an Episcopalian, which have been called liturgical Unitarians. I was interested when Stephen told me, now, we don't really want you to preach, and it's really not a sermon, it's more of a talk. And I appreciated that. I know enough Unitarians in my past to appreciate fully, I think, what your tradition is. So I took that under advisement and thought, well, okay, so what I'll do is, well, why don't I just, now that I've some distance on my last parish, from which I stepped down in 2016, almost 10 years, maybe I'll just say a few words about what I've learned in parish ministry in what was then 45 or 6 years and is now something like 53. I was preaching before I was born, of course. So thinking a bit more about that, I thought, well, not only do I want to talk about all the things I've learned but the things that I haven't learned in ministry. And so I sat down to make a list several weeks ago of all the things. Well, it got longer and longer, all the things I learned. I try to be general, just put them into categories and so on. Well, I had a list so long, I thought I was pretty darn smart. Learned all that stuff. And then I thought, well, let me see about all the things I haven't learned. And that list grew so long that I thought, this is ridiculous. These people don't want to know all that stuff. And besides, I didn't want to show off all that ignorance either. So I boiled it down to this. Well, what does it all amount to? What have I really learned, and what is it all about? And it began this way. A good friend of mine who is a journalist and who lives up in Seattle invited me in 2007 to attend a conference out in the desert in Colorado that was called the Story Field Conference. A whole lot of people came from all walks of life. There were therapists and teachers and writers and filmmakers and artists, consultants and body workers, and a few clergy, and at least one politician. And we all explored the meta-narratives, like evolution, like family stories, and political narratives, and topics of perennial concern. I came away from that understanding that the story field is that great conglomeration of experiences giving rise to all of our narratives. The following year, for my birthday, my husband Joe gave me a book by an Australian named Brian Boyd on the origin of stories, evolution, cognition, and fiction. And it sounds like tough sledding, but I would put that on the top of my all-time important books in my whole life. So ideas came from both the conference and the book, together with many conversations tracing tributaries of one or both of them, to get into the major lesson of my lifetime, which is everything is about a story. As you well know, there's no end of stories in all forms. So how can I say a story with a capital S? Well, of course, the great big story is the story of evolution. How the planet came into being and how life finally emerges on the planet and how that life has been wiped out any number of times. Specifically, the story is the way story itself is a product of our peculiar brand of consciousness. We communicate survival information as a species by means of stories in all forms. Bees do their dances, ants have their thing, animals have their thing. Ours is that we are people of stories. So Boyd examined some sample stories, particularly the Odyssey of Homer and Dr. Seuss's Horton Hears a Who. Remember that? Through them and associated reflections, he demonstrates how we have evolved to use stories in all forms: oral, printed, news, fiction, poetry, comedy, the arts, music, sports, in short, all communication to transmit survival information to each other and to our posterity. I was working on my doctoral degree at the time when I attended the Storyfield Conference, and I was particularly focusing on the function of leadership in congregations. As I took a deep dive in my own congregation in Washington, D.C., I began to understand that the story that the congregation had developed and lived out for over a century had a germ of coherence in it. The more research I did, the more I realized that what many of us in the contemporary congregation thought were relatively recent developments were consistent with a history that had been largely unknown in recent decades and unconscious to the contemporary members, but the power of that story was still being lived out, felt, and perpetuated. For example, the major strain of the story was tied to a spirit of experimentation. People got together in Columbia Heights, which was a new sort of section of the District of Columbia at the time, and they formed a Sunday school because there was none in the neighborhood. And that was kind of a radical sort of thing because it just had all kinds of people in there who were not baptized and were not necessarily in church and so on and so forth. It was very, very odd in the late 19th century for an Episcopal congregation, an Episcopal priest, to do that. Well, the parish forged ahead, and before long, that spirit of experimentation was governing things like in the pre-World War I era, women were voted on the governing body of the church. Now, that might not have been all that odd in some churches. I think it probably was. But it was certainly not only odd, but it was against all regulations in the Episcopal Church at the time. Well, they didn't care, Women were there, they were leaders, and so they'd be on the vestry. Decades before the church came around to that. And then in the 1950s, when Brown versus Board of Education and a similar case in the District of Columbia were decided by the courts and desegregation became the rule of the day, white flight to the suburbs really took off in Washington, D.C. Embarrassingly so, but it's true. Churches ultimately in that neighborhood closed up. But St. Stephen and the Incarnation remained there essentially because they had a priest at the time who went out and beat the streets to roust out African Americans who were in the neighborhood to become members of the church. And in 1957, only 3 years after Brown, the church correctly and accurately proclaimed itself the first fully integrated parish in the Diocese of Washington. And it might have been the first fully integrated parish in the city. I'm not sure about that. That spirit of experimentation wasn't born in the 1950s. It didn't come with that priest. It came in a culture which cohered around a story, the details of which they'd probably forgotten by that point. None of them had been born as long ago, or very few of them, in the 1880s when that parish was founded. Every text, every tweet, every love letter, every news article, every movie, every game, song, novel, textbook is a case of humanity communicating some idea or knowledge that fits into the big picture of how we best can live. Certainly religious narratives of all stripes exemplify powerful narratives. When New England Congregationalism encountered the advent of Unitarians, a crisis resulted from conflicting narratives. What did they say, Joe, in Cambridge, Massachusetts? You kept the furniture, but we kept the faith when it moved down the street? It turns out that neither of the meta-narratives was forgotten, but continued through different stages to this day. And you're identified with one of those narratives. People are puzzled today at how old narratives like fascism seem to have a new power of attraction, threatening the competing and for decades now the dominant narrative of democracy. In my view, current developments document that the forces leading to what we rather easily dub fascism, some of us not knowing quite what it really is, grow out of the same or similar circumstances that have always produced fascism. Fears of insecurity, fears of scarcity, confronting waves of strange people. Remember the so-called barbarian invasions that dramatically altered what we call the ancient world and introduced what we now call the Middle Ages? The same sort of thing is happening now as people, because of climate change and political events like wars and so on, rush into places like Southern Europe or come in from South America and Central America into the United States and so forth. This is nothing new, and the reaction to it neither is new. That's what happens when all of a sudden stories get jerked around and people are unprepared to adapt. And when we have forgotten the story, which we stand in great danger of doing, we continue to repeat the exigencies that created the story in the first place. Now, what's now deeply disturbing, and you all know it, is that we have evolved with the power to undermine stories with far more precision than has ever been true. A generation ago, propaganda was rather easily recognized and could be judged by standards that were largely agreed upon. If somebody told us, or we went through a museum and saw examples of Nazi propaganda, we recognized that it was propaganda. And likewise, in the Cold War era, we recognized what was propaganda. There was an agreed upon response to what it was. Now, however, news sources are contaminated by highly sophisticated means of disinformation, and none of us is immune to it. Corrupt forces justify with their own choice narratives the conspiracy theories they construct. Social media has become worldwide communication, made possible on an unprecedented scale, and at the same time has inaugurated a major source of the distortion of stories. I cannot be saying anything you don't already know. I'm just telling you that that's the major lesson that I've learned in a half century of ministry. When people come to tell you their stuff, they are telling you something holy, because that's all they are. We are our stories. When you go consulting, as I did many times in the prior decades, with congregations, and have them tell you what they are, who they are, and so on and so forth, it may not check out with what you observe to be the fact, but you know that that's the story they're telling themselves. When they tell you that they want to grow when you know it's not so, it isn't because they are just trying to lie themselves out of something. They're telling you the story that they've been told, and they have been told that story in a way that they're trying to live it out, and they don't know how to adapt it to new situations, but they tell the story because that's who and what they are. Joe and I were in an ice cream shop the other night, and never been in there before, and this fellow was standing over by the door having his own kind of thing. And I don't know whether one of us spoke to him or not, but he began telling us all about what his grandparents did in Arizona and Texas and so on and so forth. And he went into, little baby wolves and this and that and the other kind of thing. And it was just kind of a rambling narrative about a lot of stuff. It made sense, but it was something like, and I kept thinking to myself, why is he telling us all of that? And I can almost tell you why. Because he had a story. He really was looking for an audience to hear. And so we went up to pay and thanked the guys who'd served us and so forth. And one of them said to me, I really apologize for, all of that, pointing to the guy. And I said, no apologies necessary. All stories are holy. He needed an audience, and I was happy to be it, or words to that effect. Well, and then I told him, I understand you're needing to apologize too. Stories. Who we are and what we are. Well, all of that could overshadow what you probably care most deeply about, and that is your own story. Indeed, some of what I've just said could leave you wondering what you could possibly do besides resign yourself to accepting that, well, that's just the way things are. Well, of course, that's an option. But is there any other option? I believe there is. And it's something that can't be taken away from you unless you willingly allow it. Believe in the power of your own story. And I guess if I had to sum up, maybe save this for an epitaph, actually. If I had to sum up my life and my ministry, the whole shebang in a few words, I think it would be that, because that's the lesson I've really learned personally. Believe in the power of your own story. Now, not in the factuality of your story necessarily, because that can be off by a good deal. But believe in the power of it. Most of us know the main elements of our stories, the ones drawn from the externals of our biographies. Our stories are shaped by familiar things like race, ethnicity, our backgrounds, what our upbringing was like, our experiences growing up, the families we were a part of, the communities we lived in, the institutions like schools and colleges that formed us, the churches and religious traditions, the political parties we've identified with and voted for, the sports teams we were on, the neighborhoods we lived in, the affinity groups that we are part of now. All of those things are woven into our own personal narratives. We may have the fantasy that that's all there is to us, leaving aside reckoning with the fact that there's far more that we're unconscious of than that we are conscious of, that we consciously know. None of us can give a complete account of ourselves by a country mile. I couldn't. You can't. We think we can. We're told we ought to be able to. But we can't give an account of ourselves. We can't become fully conscious. And there's a tremendous reluctance on the part of human beings to become conscious at all. But that doesn't mean we don't have a story, nor does it mean that we are stuck with the narratives we currently use to understand ourselves. I don't have a template for how to construct or deconstruct or reconstruct the story of anybody, not even of myself. But I do know this. I do know that if you don't have a story will have you. Have you heard any of these accounts by some man or woman who all of a sudden, with no political affiliation particularly and no interest in it, and so will start listening to something that is full of conspiracy theories, and all of a sudden they get sucked into believing it, or you've heard of young people who get, kind of snapped up and into some kind of gang or some kind of political terrorist organization, that kind of thing like that. And you think, wow, that's awful, that's kind of awful. What's going on there? Well, I would suggest that they and all those people that you've read accounts of that participated in the January 6th insurrection a couple of years ago, a story found them. Now, some of them were maybe creating stories, but some story found those people and said, "You belong with us." That's how fascism thrives. That's how Nazism thrives. It's how Christianity thrives. If you don't have a story will find you. Now, I doubt that that's true of any of you here. You're here today, which suggests that you've identified with the story that this organization, this institution is a part of and propagates. But sometimes people drift away from the story that's been holding them because somehow or other something is missing, like identity or changes are going on or something of the sort. If you get sucked into a bigger narrative, it might just cost you big time. "50 years of ministry have taught me that religions of all kinds have often failed at their basic function, namely, giving people the tools to be whole persons." We've done a great job, most of us, in helping people conform to social norms. And that's an important function of religious institutions in some ways. We need to make moral people so we can live together in a just society. But if you ever wonder, why are so many people so willing to be unjust and so on and so forth, I can tell you why. It doesn't answer the question of how to correct it. But they're a part of a story that has reinforced a certain set of values. And they've identified with that story to the point that there's no wiggle room to enlarge it, and so on. We've been very good at helping people identify with traditions and social norms, but I came to understand about 40 years ago that if there is God, it's the God who shows up in your own experience. Most recently, I've come to understand that the power that makes the sun, the stars, the planets, and the galaxies all do their thing is the same experience we call love. It's the divine energy, the force that expresses itself as creativity and procreativity. It's the essence of erotic life, and we often feel it as desire. That's the heart of my story. I'm learning still and growing and processing it, and your story is unique to you. I fiercely resist capitulating to what I think is the general approach, at least in our culture, namely that what I've found that works for me, I know will work for you if you'd only try it. That's what drives all advertising, the entire self-help industry, cocktail party conversations galore, proselytizing. But not to be too hard on us, what we are doing and all that is just passing on to others what we think, rightly or wrongly, will enable them as well as us to survive, succeed, thrive, and maybe flourish. Many of our stories are not so true, but all of them are powerful. If we acknowledge the power of our own stories, then it seems that we must also recognize that our stories need constantly to be updated, revised, tested, lest we become blind to our own limitations. And that's the challenge, by the way, for all liberal and progressive people. Never ever to think that you've got all the answers, and if people would only follow what you think, we'd all just be ducky. That would effectively stop us from growing, and things that don't grow have a very hard time staying alive. So that's my story for you today. I hope that in some way it'll encourage you to look courageously at your own story and find in it truth that makes you free. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Frank. And for our closing hymn, Love Will Guide Us. Roger. Before we conclude, some congregational news. But first, I want to thank everybody who was part of putting the service on today, not just Reverend Frank Dunn, but the AV people, Joel at the piano, all our greeters, those who are preparing coffee hour, and I hope I didn't miss anybody, but thank you all who participated. The Social Justice Committee would like you to know that there's only 1 week left for our backpack and school supplies drive. A shopping list is on the round table for you to take with you. The deadline for dropping off your donations here at UUCOD is next Sunday, July 28th. So don't forget to bring them with you when you come to church. Let's see how full we can pack the box. In August, there are 2 opportunities for you to volunteer with Galilee Center to fill backpacks and distribute them to kids. More information and a sign-up is on the round table outside in the lobby. And if you are watching online, please take a look at last Friday's newsletter where you can sign up online. Let's help Galilee Center get East Valley students off to a good start. And Monty Hatlen will come forward to extinguish the chalice. And as he does, please read along. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And Reverend Dunn has some closing thoughts for us.
Well, thank you once again for the lovely experience of being with you this morning. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your hearts. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of other people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears. Tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain to joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world so that you can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all our children and the poor.